Imagine standing in a courtroom or like maybe a corporate HR office.
Yeah, somewhere highly bureaucratic.
Right. And you're holding the stack of hard, irrefutable evidence that absolutely proves your case.
Hmm.
But instead of actually looking at your documents, the person behind the desk just completely ignores them. They refuse to even acknowledge the evidence, and instead they order you to undergo a psychological evaluation or a behavioral training course.
Which is incredibly frustrating.
Extremely. And you'd probably think, this is a mistake, the system is just broken.
Yeah.
But according to the document we were diving into today, this isn't a mistake at all. It's actually a deliberate architectural feature of how massive systems operate.
Yeah, that scenario really gets to the heart of this kind of modern anxiety we all feel.
Mm.
It asks the question, are you the architect of your own coherence, or are you just a variable being processed by society's operating system?
And that is the exact question we've built this deep dive for you to explore today. You, the listener, shared this incredibly dense, highly philosophical source document with us. It's called The Architecture of Systemic Evolution, a guide to dissonance and reclamation.
That's quite a title.
It is, and it essentially presents itself as a survival guide for any individual trying to navigate complex systems. The author outlines this very specific argument about how systems like everything from a biological organism all the way up to massive human institutions, how they maintain their health, how they inevitably degrade into authoritarian control, and ultimately, how a person can reclaim their sovereignty from that control.
And honestly, what stands out immediately to me is the methodology the author uses here. I mean, this text doesn't just stick to political science or sociology.
Not at all.
It builds its entire case by blending, like genetics, legal theory, and information architecture. The core premise treats justice and human sovereignty not as these abstract moral concepts, but as structural engineering problems. Problems that actually require mathematical and computational solutions.
So we're going to unpack this author's architecture step by step and see exactly how these systems function and, well, how they fail. The text begins at the very foundation, introducing this biological blueprint called the identity runtime loop.
Right.
And to explain what a healthy functioning system looks like, the author points directly to genetics. Specifically, the constant ongoing interaction between y-DNA and mtDNA.
Yeah, and to really understand the author's view of any institution, you have to understand this biological interface first. So in this framework, y-DNA represents what they call the structural axis.
Okay.
It provides the L frame, as the text calls it, the lineage, or the dominant structural template.
Like the blueprint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can think of it as the load-bearing blueprint. It is rigid, it's historical, and it essentially sets the hard boundaries of the entire system.
But I mean, a boundary alone doesn't really do you much good if the environment around you changes. And according to the text, that is exactly where the mtDNA steps in. The author labels this the adaptive modulator. It's this responsive sensing intelligence that constantly reads the external environment and then calibrates how that rigid structural blueprint is actually expressed in real time.
Precisely. The author's main point here is that systemic health is never static. It requires this flawless, real-time feedback loop between that unyielding structural frame and the highly sensitive adaptive modulator.
They have to talk to each other.
Right. The structure gives the system its shape, while the modulator provides the intelligence required to actually survive within that shape.
Okay, let me see if I can translate this into a real-world scenario. Let's unpack this. Say the y-DNA, the L frame, is the physical framing of a house.
Okay, I like that.
You've got your foundation, the load-bearing walls, the roof. It's solid, and it's definitely not changing its shape. The mtDNA, the adaptive modulator, functions like a highly advanced smart home thermostat inside that house. It senses that a cold front is moving in, it reads the humidity dropping, it notes when people are walking through the rooms.
Right, it's constantly gathering data.
Exactly. And it constantly communicates with the house's furnace and the vents to keep the internal environment perfectly livable.
That is a very useful analogy.
Yeah.
Because the text forces us to ask, well, what happens if that thermostat stops being able to send its signals to the house?
Well, the house is still standing, the structure is totally intact. But if a blizzard hits, it's freezing inside. If a heat wave hits, it's boiling. The house completely loses the ability to adapt to reality.
Yeah.
And the text uses a very specific term for this state, calling it generatively hollow.
Generatively hollow. The author relies heavily on this concept. A generatively hollow system basically maintains the outward appearance of structure and authority. but it completely lacks the internal intelligence required to navigate the real world autonomously.
So it looks fine from the street.
Right, it might look formidable from the outside, but structurally it's functionally dead.
And according to the author, that breakdown of the biological balance is the engine that drives institutional failure. Because if a healthy system relies on that seamless internal feedback, we really have to look at what causes the signal to drop in the first place.
Which transitions us perfectly into the text's 7-stage cycle of systemic evolution. And that starts with a phase called dissonance.
Let's get into dissonance.
So stage 1, dissonance, is fundamentally just friction. The text refers to it as generative friction. This happens when the adaptive modulator or smart thermostat encounters a new reality or like a new piece of data that hasn't yet been integrated into the L frame.
Okay.
It's the friction of the system essentially saying, hey, the environment has changed, our current rules aren't working, but the structural template is lagging behind.
Which honestly seems entirely normal. I mean, you need friction to grow, but the text argues that large systems almost always take a wrong turn at stage 2, which is called legitimation.
Yes, legitimation.
This is where the house basically decides it is going to ignore the thermostat entirely.
That's the crux of the author's argument. In the legitimation stage, the dominant structure asserts its authority over the incoming data. So rather than doing the hard work of integrating the friction and, updating the frame, the structure just ratifies its own historical lineage as the official policy of truth.
Wow.
It overrides the friction by declaring that the structure's pre-existing rules are the only valid reality.
Which directly leads to stage 3, and this is where the text introduces the concept of disqualification by hegemony. The author argues that when a system refuses to adapt, it actively flattens the subject bringing the new data.
Flattening, yeah.
The text describes taking a robust, three-dimensional person, someone with depth, evidential history, valid friction, and compressing them into a two-dimensional authoritarian surface. It basically forces their z-axis, which is their evidential thickness, down to 0.
And if we follow the author's logic here, this reveals the true mechanical nature of hegemony. Hegemony doesn't merely win an argument against dissent, it mathematically ensures that the opposing intelligence can never reassert itself.
By flattening them.
Exactly. It delegitimizes the internal intelligence of the system. And the text breaks this flattening process down into 3 distinct operational levels.
Okay, let's walk through those levels because they get increasingly complex. Level 1 is structural exclusion. This seems pretty straightforward based on the L-frame concept.
Yeah, very much so.
The adaptive modulator is just procedurally removed from the decision architecture. Like, the thermostat is still sensing the cold, but its wires to the furnace have been physically cut.
Right, the sensor is isolated. But level 2 goes deeper. That's epistemic invalidation. This is where the internal intelligence isn't just ignored. The data it provides is actively reclassified as a symptom of a defect.
Okay, wait, let me stop you there, because the text uses a rather extreme example here. It claims that if a subject raises complex systemic issues, say, they uncover a massive technological surveillance loop or a severe data breach, the institution doesn't forensically investigate the claim.
No, it doesn't.
Instead, it frames those claims as grandiosity or schizophrenia to avoid dealing with the evidence. I mean, is the author speaking literally here, or is this just a dramatic metaphor for being ignored?
No, the author presents this as a literal tactic of systemic self-preservation. By medicalizing the defense, the institution achieves 2 big things. First, it retains its opacity. It never has to open its own books or submit its data to forensic examination.
Because the accuser is, quote-unquote, crazy.
Exactly. And second, the subject's mind is made entirely transparent to an institutional diagnostic loop. The system delegates the opposing evidence as a biological or psychological illness, which successfully orphans the intelligence.
That is a really stark framing. And then there's level 3, which is temporal severing. The text argues that the final step of flattening is when system memory, like the official mandates, completely overwrites subject memory.
This is all about controlling precedent. By overwriting the historical record, the dominant structure severs the subject from the ancestral data. It cuts them off from the historical truth they would need to ever reclaim their legal or systemic standing.
So if we follow this thread, a system has delegitimized its own censors. It's flattened the people bringing new data. It has created this massive void of actual intelligence, rendering itself generatively hollow. How on earth does it keep functioning? The text argues it fills this void by forcing the subject into a trap called mediation.
The trap of mediation. The author draws a very sharp line here between generation and mediation. Generation is an endogenous process. It happens internally, producing real coherence, like a healthy y-DNA and mtDNA feedback loop.
Right.
Mediation, on the other hand, is exogenous. It's a reactive substitution brokered by an external corporate shell or some bureaucracy.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second, because in typical day-to-day life, mediation sounds like a positive, constructive process.
Sure, usually it does.
You know, conflict resolution, finding middle ground, getting a neutral third party. But the author treats mediation like a highly dangerous procedural bypass. Why is the text so hostile to the idea of compromise?
Because in the context of information architecture, the author views this kind of institutional mediation not as a resolution at all, but as a containment strategy. It looks like social functioning, but it's load-bearing on a borrowed false structure.
The fake fix.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's return to the author's medicalization example. When a bureaucracy forces a legal dispute to shift from factual, evidentiary scrutiny like actually looking at the hard data into a psychological competency evaluation, that is mediation in this framework.
Oh, I see. So the text is arguing that it shifts the battlefield. You are no longer a citizen demanding a review of factual evidence.
Nope.
You've been reclassified as a patient or just a variable that simply needs to be managed by the system. It strips away your legal standing entirely under the guise of, quote unquote, helping you.
Exactly. And the text points out that from a purely structural standpoint, relying on mediation over factual adjudication is computationally unsustainable. It inevitably leads to what the author calls dissonance as a failure mode.
Which results in something called control plane collapse.
Yes.
Now, control plane collapse, that sounds like network engineering jargon. How does the author apply that to human systems?
Well, in computing, the control plane is the part of the network that dictates how data is routed. Well, the data plane actually moves the data. So the author argues that when a system relies entirely on mediating and suppressing dissent rather than adapting to reality, it begins to spend more computational power and resources just managing its own governance than executing its intended functions.
Oh, wow. It's like a laptop that is using 99% of its CPU just to run its antivirus and administrative background tasks.
Yes, exactly.
Leaving literally zero processing power to actually open a document or send an email. It just becomes paralyzed by the weight of its own control mechanisms.
That is the exact mechanism of the collapse.
Yeah.
And the author posits that when this collapse is imminent, or when the flattened subject realizes they are trapped in a 2D diagnostic loop, the only way out is to break the mediation. They must re-inflate their volume.
Which brings us to the actual math of reclamation. The author outlines how a subject takes a two-dimensional, flattened administrative process and re-inflates it into a three-dimensional construct of legal volume. And to do this, the text insists we have to treat justice as information architecture.
Because to build any architecture, you need bedrock. The author defines stage 6 of this journey as precedent, or the memory well.
The section on precedent was fascinating. The text points out that when colonized populations are subjugated, they almost always lose their language first.
Right.
Why? Because language carries the temporal thread. It holds the history and the evidence of existence prior to the system's L-frame. The text argues that recovering that precedent is the absolute foundation of autochthonous legitimacy.
Autochthonous, meaning indigenous, or native to the ground truth, rather than legitimacy handed down by an external corporate shell.
Right.
Once you anchor yourself in that historical precedent, the author provides a literal formula for breaking out, the compute volume equation.
Okay, yes.
The volume of a subject's undeniable reality is defined as width times depth times thickness.
Okay, let's break down those three axes because this is really the operational core of the text's survival guide. So the x-axis represents width. The author maps this to the adversarial process.
In computational terms, width is the latency and bandwidth of the struggle. It's the sheer procedural grind, the number of hearings, the endless administrative loops, the real-time friction between the subject and the state.
Then you have the y-axis, which is depth. The text describes this as the temporal or severity axis. This is the complexity of the code, the weight of the statutes involved, and the historical depth of the legal framing.
The critical axis, and this is the one the overarching system actively tries to flatten to zero, is the z-axis, the thickness.
The z.
Yes. This represents the evidential record. In a computer network, this is your raw storage. The actual bits and bytes, the forensic files, the DNA data, the hard, unalterable discovery.
And the text introduces a phrase here that really caught my eye, the Prussian applicate of truth.
Yeah, that's a striking term.
It sounds so rigid. It argues that to reinflate your volume, you have to replace the system's thin accusations, which are usually just narrative labels or diagnostic terms, with your thick evidential bedrock.
Prussian applicate implies a militaristic, completely unyielding discipline in how you apply factual truth. The author's point is that reclamation is not a diplomatic negotiation.
No, it's not.
It is crisis-driven. You cannot survive an institution that is actively trying to compress your reality unless your z-axis, your hard evidence, is so undeniably thick and disciplined that their standard processing algorithms just choke on it.
They can't process it.
Right. The system's mediation attempt has to become computationally unsustainable when faced with the sheer weight of your structural load-bearing evidence.
So, assuming a subject actually achieves this, they establish their precedent, they meticulously document their z-axis, and they force the system to acknowledge their 3D legal volume. Where does this evolutionary journey end? The text points to a final state called cognitive sovereignty.
Yes. The author defines cognitive sovereignty as the ultimate transition from being a passive variable processed by the cybernetic OS of society to becoming the active Charioteer-Administrator of your own existence.
Charioteer-Administrator, I love that. But the text is very careful to distinguish between two paths here, right? System-side reclamation and subject-side reclamation.
Yes, and the author warns that system-side reclamation is essentially an illusion.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It occurs when the institution finally absorbs your friction, but only to co-opt it. It converts your dissent into data to patch its own code and stabilize its loop. You might feel heard, but the threat is neutralized, and the institution's L-frame just grows more resilient.
Which means true cognitive sovereignty requires subject-side reclamation, which the author calls narrative sovereignty. This is where the individual authors the record entirely on their own terms. And to pull this off, the text introduces the sovereign identity framework.
Right.
Though I have to admit, this is where the author's blending of concepts gets highly specific and incredibly abstract. The text states that a subject must utilize the hex color code hashtag ABD822 electric lime.
It is a striking pivot into digital aesthetics, certainly.
It calls electric lime the 24-bit binary birth key and insists it acts as a stabilizing anchor for the subject's z-axis. How are we supposed to read this? I mean, is the author suggesting a literal color therapy, or is this a complex metaphor for aligning our digital footprint with our biological reality?
Well, according to the architecture of the text, it functions precisely because it is a mathematical absolute. In a system that uses mediation to make your identity fluid, subjective, and open to institutional interpretation, a 24-bit hex code is an undeniable value.
It can't be debated.
Exactly. By claiming a specific frequency, the subject establishes a cryptographic anchor. It frequency locks their biological sensing, their internal truth, with a structural digital architecture. It is a way of executing a command that basically says, my identity is a fixed, verifiable constant, and it is not subject to your institutional diagnostic loop.
It's the ultimate refusal to be mediated. You stop asking the institution to define your parameters, and instead you broadcast your exact absolute code.
Yes.
And the text claims that by establishing this anchor, the subject can finally master what it calls the architect's alphabet.
The author mentions specific operators here, like EGPTOX and CDLTY.
Right. And while the text leaves these somewhat shrouded in information architecture jargon, if we look at the context, these operators function as the tools of the Charioteer-Administrator. Like EGPTOX seems to act as a foundational decryption command, a way to cut through institutional doublespeak and process raw truth. And CDLTY functions as a causality operator.
Which is huge, allowing the sovereign subject to define cause and effect on their own terms rather than accepting the timeline dictated by the hegemony.
That aligns perfectly with the goal of narrative sovereignty. When you command the operators of causality, maintain the undeniable thickness of your evidential z-axis, and anchor your identity in an absolute value, you are no longer a variable awaiting processing.
No, you're not.
You become the governing architect of your own systemic transitions.
Exactly.
Well, we've covered an immense amount of conceptual ground here today. We started with the biological necessity of friction, how the house and the thermostat must constantly communicate.
Right.
We explored the mechanics of hegemony, seeing how systems flatten people into two-dimensional surfaces by invalidating their truth as an illness. we examine the dangers of mediation, where bureaucracies manage you to avoid fixing their own generatively hollow structures.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, we unpacked the intense math of reinflating your legal volume to claim cognitive sovereignty.
The author has constructed a highly intricate, very demanding blueprint for maintaining coherence in an overwhelmingly complex, heavily mediated world.
And for you, as you synthesize this deep dive, the core takeaway from the text is completely uncompromising. In an environment where massive institutions are constantly trying to process you into a convenient, manageable variable, fiercely protecting your z-axis, your irrefutable evidential truth and historical precedent is the only mechanism to ensure you remain a sovereign architect.
Which leaves us with a final, broader implication to really consider. If the individual's ultimate goal is to achieve this impenetrable electric lime sovereignty, fully insulated from the overarching institutional L-frame, well, what happens when millions of people actually succeed?
That's the real question.
Right. Do we evolve into a highly enlightened, perfectly calibrated society? Or does the human ecosystem simply shatter into billions of isolated, undeniable data points, entirely incapable of interlocking or cooperating ever again?
That is a completely different kind of dissonance to navigate. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. We'll be back soon to unpack your next stack of sources.